The air in Annapolis clung to my skin, a thick, wet blanket of humidity that smelled of brine and old brick. It was a world away from the dry, sun-baked heat of San Antonio, a world built on traditions I couldn't yet name. My duffel bag, stuffed with everything I owned that met the Academy's strict specifications, felt like an anchor on my shoulder. I stood on the edge of the courtyard, a sea of identical white workshirts and dark trousers swirling around me, a cacophony of confident laughter and shouted greetings. I was an island. A very small, very quiet island in a roaring ocean of legacy and expectation. Everywhere I looked, there were handshakes that looked like they'd been practiced for generations, embraces between sons and daughters of officers who had served together. I saw one boy, his posture impossibly straight, get clapped on the back by a man in a crisp civilian suit. "Your father would be proud," the man boomed, and the boy nodded, a look of inherited certainty in his eyes. I tightened my grip on my duffel strap, the coarse nylon ruff against my palm. My father was a mechanic. His hands were always stained with grease, and his pride was a quiet, solid thing, expressed in the reliable rumble of an engine he'd brought back to life. It was a good pride, an honest one, but it felt a million miles away from this. "Hey, are you Valdez?" The voice was bright, cutting through my isolation like a sunbeam. I turned to see a girl with a riot of red curls barely contained under her uniform cover, a smile so wide and genuine it seemed to take up her whole face. She was clutching a room assignment slip identical to mine. "Isabella, right? I'm Sarah Jenkins. Looks like we're roommates." She thrust out her hand and I took it automatically. Her shake was firm, enthusiastic. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Our room is in Bancroft Hall, 3rd floor. It's a maze in there. I swear I got lost twice just finding the check-in desk. Come on, I think I know the way now." She didn't wait for an answer, just started weaving through the crowd, talking a mile a minute. "I'm from Ohio, Dayton specifically. You're from Texas, right? I saw it on the roster. It must be so different here. All this water, I've never seen so much water in my life." Her chatter was a lifeline. I followed her, my silence a stark contrast to her effervescence, but she didn't seem to mind. Our room was a small, stark rectangle with 2 identical desks, 2 identical beds, and a window that looked out onto the courtyard I'd just escaped. It was impersonal, institutional, but Sarah immediately started infusing it with life, unpacking a small, faded photograph of her family and propping it on her desk. "That's my mom, my dad, and my little brother, who is an absolute menace," she said, catching me looking. "You should put yours up too. Makes it feel less like a prison cell." I nodded, unzipping my duffel. My own photo was of my parents and me standing in front of our house, the pecan tree in the yard casting dappled shade. It was a world away. I set it carefully on the desk, the simple act making the sterile space feel a fraction more like mine. The next few days were a blur of orientation, a relentless torrent of information, rules, and expectations. We were issued more gear, taught how to make our beds with hospital corners so tight you could bounce a coin off the blanket, and drilled on the countless customs of the Academy. It was during one of these sessions, a lecture on the history of the yard, that I first saw him. We were filed into a large auditorium, plebes all, a mass of nervous energy. The upperclassman leading the session was pointing out features on a large map. "And this is Dewey Field, where you will undoubtedly learn the true meaning of physical exertion," he said with a smirk. A low groan rippled through the room. "Oh, lighten up," a voice drawled from a few rows behind me. I didn't mean to look, but the tone, so full of casual assurance, pulled my head around. It was a guy with close-cropped blonde hair and a strong jaw, leaning back in his seat as if he owned it. He was surrounded by a group of other midshipmen who seemed to hang on his every word. "It's tradition. My grandfather always said the field separates the wheat from the chaff." One of his friends chuckled. "Easy for you to say, Mitchell. Your grandfather probably designed the obstacle course." Lucas Mitchell. The name floated to me from a conversation I'd overheard earlier. His family name was practically etched into the Academy's foundation. He caught me looking, and his eyes, a cool, assessing blue, scanned over me. There was no recognition, no curiosity, just a brief, dismissive flicker before he turned back to his friends. It was like I was a piece of furniture. A heat that had nothing to do with the Maryland humidity flushed my neck. I faced forward again, focusing on the map until the lines blurred. The real battleground, I quickly learned, wasn't the obstacle course or the parade ground. It was the classroom. Specifically, Professor Chen's physics class. It was a subject I loved, a world of clear, elegant rules where hard work yielded undeniable answers. It was a refuge from the social complexities of the yard. Professor Chen was a man of few words, but each one carried weight. A retired captain, he had a stillness about him that commanded attention. He didn't need to raise his voice. On the day of our first major lecture on thermodynamics, the room was tense. A complex problem was on the board, a real brain twister involving heat transfer and entropy. The solution requires an understanding of the fundamental principles, not just rote memorization, Professor Chen said, his gaze sweeping the room. Can anyone describe the path to the solution? Silence. I could feel the collective intake of breath, the shuffling of feet. I saw Lucas Mitchell frowning at his notebook, his pen tapping impatiently. The equation was daunting, but I saw the logic, the pieces waiting to be assembled. It was like a puzzle my dad would lay out on the kitchen table. My hand, almost of its own volition, went up. Professor Chen's eyebrows lifted slightly. Ms. Valdez. I stood, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be at first. You have to consider the system as adiabatic initially, sir, I began, which means the internal energy change is equal to the work done. I walked through the steps, my voice gaining strength as I followed the familiar path of reasoning. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, but I kept my own fixed on the chalkboard, on the clean lines of the problem. When I finished, there was a beat of silence. Correct, Professor Chen said, a hint of something that might have been approval in his tone. A clear and concise application of the first law. Well done. As I sat down, a wave of relief washed over me, followed by a small, fierce spark of pride. But then I caught a movement to my left. Lucas Mitchell was staring at me, his earlier frown deepened into a scowl. It wasn't just annoyance, it was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. He leaned over and muttered something to the guy next to him, who glanced at me and smirked. The spark of pride sputtered and died, replaced by a cold knot in my stomach. I had drawn a line in the sand, and I hadn't even realized it. The first exam was a week later. I spent every spare moment in the library, the quiet hum of the ventilation system my only companion. Sarah would try to drag me out for coffee, for a walk, but I'd just shake my head, pointing to my textbook. You're going to burn out, Issa, she'd warn, her loyalty manifesting as concern. But I couldn't stop. It felt like every equation I mastered, every problem I solved, was another brick in a wall I was building around myself. When the graded exams were returned, the professor called out the top score first. Valdez, 98%. A few people turned to look. Sarah nudged me, beaming. I knew it, I knew you aced it. I took the paper from Professor Chen, his fingers brushing mine. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. The number at the top, circled in red, should have felt like a victory. But all I could feel was the weight of Lucas Mitchell's glare from across the room. He snatched his own exam, an 89% scrawled on it, and stuffed it into his backpack without a word. After class, the hallway was crowded, a river of white workshirts flowing toward the next obligation. I was lagging behind, stuffing my own exam into my bag, my mind already picking apart the 2 points I'd lost. Sarah was ahead, chatting with someone. As I moved to catch up, I had to pass a recessed alcove near a drinking fountain, and that's when I heard it. His voice, low and venomous. I stopped, frozen, hidden by the press of bodies moving past me. Lucas was there, leaning against the wall, his friend from the auditorium beside him. An 89, Mitchell, that's still good, his friend was saying. It's not about the score, Lucas snapped, his voice tight with anger. It's about her. Valdez, did you see her? She acts like she's discovered cold fusion. She's just memorizing. There's no intuition, no feel for it. It's all brute force studying. So, she got the top score. Gotta give credit where it's due. Lucas let out a short, harsh laugh. Credit? She's a grind. A nobody from God knows, where who thinks she can hack it here because she can memorize a textbook. People like her don't get it. This isn't just about grades. It's about character. It's about bearing. You can't study your way into that. His words were like physical blows, each one landing with a sickening thud in my chest. Then came the whisper. The one that would echo in my head for weeks, for months. He lowered his voice, but I heard every syllable, crisp and cruel. She doesn't belong here. The world seemed to narrow to that single phrase. The noise of the hallway faded into a dull roar. I felt the rough texture of the brick wall against my back as I instinctively pressed into it, trying to make myself smaller to disappear. A nobody from God knows where. A grind? You can't study your way into that. She doesn't belong here. The words carved a hollow space inside me. They gave voice to the fear that had been my silent companion since I'd first received my acceptance letter, the doubt that crept in every time I saw a legacy student greeted by an admiral, every time I had to ask what a basic naval term meant. He had seen it, Lucas Mitchell, with his cold blue eyes. He had seen the outsider, the imposter, and he had named it. I don't know how long I stood there. The crowd thinned. Sarah was probably wondering where I was. I pushed myself off the wall, my legs feeling weak. I didn't look toward the alcove. I just started walking, my eyes fixed on the worn linoleum floor ahead of me. That night, after lights out, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the courtyard lights filtering through the blinds. Sarah's breathing was soft and regular from the other bed. I could hear the distant sound of a boat horn on the Severn River, a lonely, mournful sound. The humiliation was a live wire under my skin. I replayed the scene in the hallway over and over, each time feeling the same hot flush of shame. I wanted to cry, to scream, to find Lucas Mitchell and what? Prove him right by showing I was too emotional, too weak. That's what he'd expect. That's what would confirm his every prejudice. A different emotion began to push its way through the hurt, a hard, sharp-edged thing. Resolve. If he thought I was just a grind, a memorizer, then let him. If he thought I didn't belong here because my name wasn't on a building, then I would make myself belong. Not by trying to be like him, but by being better than him. On my own terms, with my own weapons. Quietly, I slipped out of bed. I pulled on a sweatshirt over my PT shorts and laced up my running shoes. Sarah stirred. "Issa," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "You okay?" "Fine," I whispered. "Just going for a run, go back to sleep." The Bancroft Hall hallway was deserted, illuminated by the dim night lighting. My footsteps were soft echoes on the polished floor. I didn't go outside. Instead, I found the stairwell and started climbing, my breath coming in steady puffs. Up and up until I reached a deserted study carrel on the top floor, a small nook with a single desk and a chair that overlooked the dark, sleeping yard. I pulled out my physics textbook and the exam I had aced. I smoothed out the paper, the 98% glaring up at me. It wasn't a badge of honor anymore, it was a battle standard. This was my ground. This was where I would fight. He thought I didn't belong? Fine. I would work until this place, every brick, every equation, every tradition was mine. Not by birthright, but by sheer, unrelenting effort. I would become so good, so undeniably capable, that his whispers would be drowned out by the simple, unassailable truth of my competence. The anger settled into a cold, focused core inside me. It wasn't a noisy anger. It was a quiet one, a tenacious one. It was the kind of anger that could fuel 4 years of early mornings and late nights. I opened the textbook to the next chapter. The words on the page were a promise, a challenge. Outside, the first hint of dawn was a pale gray line on the horizon. I picked up my pencil and began to read. The humid Maryland air, thick enough to drink, had lost some of its power to shock my system. 2 years in Annapolis had inured me to the way summer clung to your skin like a second uniform. The shock now came from other places, like the public rankings board outside Bancroft Hall. It was a simple sheet of paper protected by a plexiglass cover, but it held more power over our daily lives than any admiral. This was where the class standings were posted each semester, a brutal, public accounting of who was winning and who was losing the quiet war of academics. My eyes, as they always did, went straight to the top. And there it was, in stark black type, VALDZ, Isabella, 1935. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped in a quiet sigh. It wasn't relief, exactly, more like the acknowledgement of a battle won, with the certainty that the war would only intensify. The number 1 was a validation, a hard-won trophy forged from late nights in the library, from flashcards memorized during every spare minute, from a relentless focus that had become my primary identity. But it was also a target. I felt a presence beside me before I saw him. Lucas Mitchell, his blonde hair perfectly regulation length, his posture radiating an entitlement that 4 semesters had done nothing to diminish. He stared at the board, his jaw tight. I could see the calculations happening behind his cold blue eyes. He was second. Again. Valdez, he said, the name a flat statement, devoid of any acknowledgement of my rank or my achievement. Mitchell, I replied, my voice even quieter than usual. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing any reaction. Must be nice, he murmured, just loud enough for me to hear over the chatter of other midshipmen gathering around the board. Having a dedicated tutor in the history department. The implication hung in the air, poisonous and subtle. I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze for the first time. I don't have a tutor, Mitchell. He offered a thin, condescending smile. Of course not, just favorable winds, I suppose. Some of us have to rely on raw talent and family tradition. He gave a slight, dismissive shake of his head before turning and walking away, his white uniform crisp and perfect. The message was clear. My success wasn't earned, it was gifted. And the gift-giver in his narrative was Professor Chen. The accusation burrowed under my skin, a tiny seed of doubt and anger. I worked for this. I bled for this. Every point on my GPA was a direct result of sweat and sacrifice, of foregoing the easy camaraderie that Sarah effortlessly built, of treating my education like a mission. To have it reduced to favoritism was a special kind of insult. I found my sanctuary an hour later in the hushed, wood-paneled silence of Professor Chen's office. The scent of old books and lemon polish was a balm. He'd asked to see me to discuss my midterm paper on Mahan's theories of sea power, an essay I'd poured myself into. Your analysis of naval logistics as a determinant of imperial reach was exceptional, Midshipman Valdez, Professor Chen said, leaning back in his worn leather chair. He wasn't just a professor, he was Captain Chen, retired, and the weight of that experience was always present in his calm, assessing eyes. You connected dots I haven't seen a youngster make before. It was intuitive. Thank you, sir, I said, sitting ramrod straight in the chair opposite his desk. The praise warmed me, but Lucas's words echoed, tainting it. Was this favoritism? Was he seeing something that wasn't there because he wanted to? Professor Chen seemed to sense the shift in my demeanor. He was preternaturally perceptive. That's the face of someone who has a question they're afraid to ask. Out with it, Valdez. This office is a judgment-free zone. I hesitated, my fingers tracing the grain of the wooden armrest. Sir, do you think is my work truly that good, or am I just a novelty? His eyebrows rose slightly. A novelty. The rankings came out today, I said, the words feeling like a confession. Some people seem to think my position there has more to do with your influence than my own work. He didn't react with anger or immediate denial. He steepled his fingers, his gaze thoughtful. I see, and these some people, would one of them be Midshipman Mitchell? I didn't need to confirm it. He saw the answer on my face. Isabella, he said, using my first name, a rare occurrence that signaled he was speaking not as professor to student, but as mentor to protege. Let me tell you something about being first or being an only. It is a burden. Every mistake you make will be magnified, attributed to your background, seen as proof that you don't belong. And every success, he paused, letting the words sink in. Every success will be scrutinized, minimized, attributed to luck or favoritism. The goalposts will constantly move. The moment you clear one hurdle, another, higher one will be placed in front of you. He leaned forward, his voice low and intent. You are not a novelty. You are one of the most naturally gifted strategic minds I have encountered in 20 years of teaching. Your work is not good for someone from your background. It is objectively, unequivocally, excellent. Full stop. The fact that you have to work twice as hard to have your achievements recognized as half as much is an injustice, but it is also your reality. You cannot control the rumors, Isabella. You can only control your response. You must be so undeniably, impeccably competent that the whispers become background noise, drowned out by the sheer volume of your performance. His words were a shield, reforging my resolve. He was right. Arguing with Lucas, trying to defend myself against shadows, was a losing battle. The only language people like Mitchell understood was undeniable, public success. I understand, sir, I said, my voice firmer. Good, he said, a faint smile touching his lips. Now, let's talk about why your conclusion on the limitations of Mahan's doctrine in a cyber warfare context was too timid. I think you can be bolder. I left his office an hour later, my mind buzzing with new ideas and a renewed sense of purpose. The walk back to my room was a blur of tactical calculations. Professor Chen had given me the strategy. I needed to execute it. Sarah was waiting for me, perched on the edge of her bed, a textbook open but ignored in her lap. The moment I closed the door, her bubbly energy filled the small space. "Well, how did it go with the Oracle? Did he bestow upon you the secrets of the universe?" I managed a small smile. "Something like that. We talked about my paper." "And the rankings?" she exclaimed, bouncing up. "Number 1, Izzy, that's incredible. We have to celebrate. I'll sneak us some of that awful coffee from the vending machine downstairs. We can drink it like it's champagne." Her enthusiasm was infectious, a stark contrast to the tension I just navigated. "Thanks, Sarah." I sank onto my own bed, the fatigue of the constant pressure settling deep in my bones. She studied me, her expression shifting from celebratory to concerned. "Okay, what's wrong? You have that look. The one you get when you're mentally running damage control on a 5-alarm fire." I sighed, giving up on trying to hide it. Sarah could read me like a book. "It's Mitchell. He was at the board. He made a comment, implied that Professor Chen is giving me special treatment. That's why I'm ranked first." Sarah's face darkened with immediate, loyal anger. "That entitled, pompous, ugh. His family tree is so intertwined with the Navy he probably has barnacles on his backside. He can't stand that someone who actually earned her spot is beating him. It's pathetic." "It is," I agreed. "But Professor Chen said I can't fight the rumor. I just have to be better, so good that it doesn't matter." "He's not wrong," Sarah said, tapping her chin thoughtfully. "But being better academically is what you're already doing. That's your comfort zone. To really shut him up, you need to step out of it. You need to lead." "Lead what?" I asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. Leading meant being seen, being vocal, being the center of attention. All the things I avoided. "Everything," she said, waving a hand. "Volunteer to head up the navigation practical next week. It's a beast. Everyone dreads it. If you lead your team through it successfully, no one can say a thing. They'll have to respect it. Leadership is the one thing Mitchell thinks is his birthright. Take it from him." The navigation practical was legendary. A multi-day exercise simulating a complex voyage, testing every aspect of seamanship, teamwork, and decision-making under pressure. The thought of being responsible for a team, for their success or failure, sent a cold trickle of fear down my spine. But Sarah was right. It was the perfect battlefield. The rumor, however, didn't remain a quiet insinuation between Lucas and me. It found its way into the mess hall 2 days later, carried on the careless chatter of a table of midshipmen from another company. Sarah and I were sitting a few tables away, picking at our chicken and rice. I heard my name and Professor Chen's, and the word tutoring spoken with a knowing laugh. Before I could even process it, Sarah was on her feet. Her usually cheerful face was set in a mask of fury. She marched over to their table, and the entire hall seemed to quieten by a few decibels. "Is there something you'd like to ask Midshipman Valdez directly?" Sarah's voice cut through the clatter of cutlery, instead of gossiping about her like a bunch of old hens. One of the guys, a lanky midshipman named Davis, had the decency to look embarrassed. "Take it easy, Jenkins. It's just talk." "It's slander," Sarah shot back, her hands on her hips. "Isabella Valdez is ranked first in our class because she's the smartest, hardest-working person here. She spends more time in the library before breakfast than you probably do all week. If you put half the effort into your studies that you do into spreading garbage rumors, maybe you'd crack the top half of the rankings." My face was burning. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. This was the opposite of staying quiet, of being undeniably competent in the background. This was a spotlight, harsh and unforgiving. Lucas, sitting at a nearby table with his usual cohort of legacy kids, watched the scene unfold with a smirk. He saw my discomfort, saw Sarah's fiery defense, and he knew he'd gotten under my skin. He'd forced the conflict into the open. Commander Reed appeared at the entrance to the mess hall, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. She didn't say a word, but her presence was enough to silence everyone. Sarah, seeing her, immediately snapped back to a posture of attention before returning to our table, her cheeks flushed with adrenaline. "Sorry," she whispered as she sat down. "I just couldn't listen to it." "It's okay," I murmured, though my stomach was in knots. The damage was done. The rumor was now public knowledge, and my response, or lack thereof, would be scrutinized. Commander Reed's gaze swept over the room, lingering on me for a fraction of a second longer than anyone else. She knew. Of course she knew. The next morning, when the sign-up sheet for navigation practical team leaders was posted, my hand was steady as I wrote my name at the top of the list. It felt less like a choice and more like a necessity, a gauntlet thrown down. Sarah, standing beside me, squeezed my arm. "That's my girl," she whispered. The practical itself was a blur of salt spray, complex charts, and sleep deprivation. We were on the water for 36 grueling hours, battling currents, shifting winds, and simulated system failures. My team, a mix of personalities and skill levels, looked to me for every decision. The weight of command was a physical thing, a pressure on my chest that made it hard to breathe. But a strange thing happened out on the Chesapeake Bay. The skills I'd honed in solitude, the intense focus, the ability to process multiple streams of information, the calm analysis under pressure, translated directly into leadership. I didn't shout orders or try to emulate the loud, assertive style I saw in others. I listened to my team's inputs, made decisions quickly and clearly, and delegated tasks based on their strengths. I led not from a place of arrogance, but from a place of competence. When we finally navigated our small craft back to the dock, having successfully completed every leg of the simulated journey ahead of schedule, the exhaustion was tempered by a profound sense of accomplishment. My team, weary but united, offered me nods of respect. "Good job, Valdez," one of them said, and it felt more meaningful than any ranking. As we secured the lines and prepared to debrief, I saw Lucas's team coming in behind us. They looked disheveled and frustrated, arguing amongst themselves. Lucas's face was dark with anger. He caught my eye, and for the first time I didn't look away. I held his gaze, my own expression neutral. The message was silent but clear. This was earned. Commander Reed was waiting on the dock, her clipboard in hand. She observed the return of each team, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She nodded to me as I passed. "A clean execution, Midshipman Valdez, well led." The praise from her, a woman who doled out compliments with eyedropper precision, was a victory in itself. I walked back to Bancroft Hall, my body aching, my uniform stiff with salt, but my head was held higher than it had been in weeks. I had faced the rumor not with words, but with action. I had stepped into the light, and I hadn't blinked. That night, lying in the dark, listening to Sarah's steady breathing from the other side of the room, the weariness settled deep. It was a different kind of tired than the academic exhaustion I was used to. This was heavier, more complex. The scrutiny Professor Chen had warned me about was now a constant presence. Lucas's antagonism had evolved from casual dismissal to a strategic, targeted campaign. I had proven myself today, but I knew it was just one battle. The war of perception was endless, and I was tired. The weight of being undeniable was a lonely burden to carry. The scent of old paper and ambition was a familiar perfume in the library's deepest carol. It was late, the kind of late where the world outside the leaded glass windows was a pool of ink, and the only sounds were the hum of the climate control and the soft rustle of my turning pages. My fingers, smudged with graphite and ink, traced the lines of a primary source, a letter from Admiral Forrestal himself, written in a tight, anxious script during the Guadalcanal campaign. The Forrestal essay. The name alone carried a weight that made the air in my carol feel thicker. This wasn't just another assignment. It was a cornerstone of the Academy's legacy, a chance to weave historical analysis with contemporary naval strategy into something that wasn't just correct, but profound. Winning it was a public anointing, a mark of intellectual rigor that would follow an officer for their entire career. And everyone knew it was between two people, me and Lucas Mitchell. 2.5 years had hardened us all. The baby fat had melted from our faces, replaced by the sharper angles of adulthood and the constant, low-grade fatigue of perpetual challenge. I was 20, a second-class midshipman now, my plebe year a distant, painful memory. The Public Standings Board had become a familiar battlefield, my name and Lucas's perpetually seesawing for the top spot. The quiet, simmering resentment he'd shown that day after the first posting had never truly dissipated. It had just been buried under layers of regulation, tradition, and the sheer, exhausting business of survival. "You're going to burn a hole through that page if you stare any harder." I looked up to see Sarah leaning against the Carol entrance, holding 2 steaming mugs. She'd become my anchor, her relentless optimism a counterbalance to my own intense focus. Her presence was a warmth in the sterile quiet. "I'm just trying to figure out what he wasn't saying," I said, accepting the mug. The rich smell of hot chocolate, a rare and cherished contraband, cut through the dust of history. Everyone analyzes his decisions, his official memos. But this, I tapped the photocopy of the personal letter, this is where the real fear is. He's writing to his wife, talking about the weight of sending boys to die. That's the heart of it, not the tactics, but the burden. Sarah slid into the chair opposite me, her own books thudding onto the desk. "See, that's why you're going to win. Mitchell is probably in his room writing a 10-point manifesto on why Admiral Forrestal's formation was the pinnacle of naval brilliance. You're looking for the man's pulse." "Mitchell's essay will be flawless," I said, a familiar knot tightening in my stomach. "Perfectly structured, impeccably sourced from every approved text. It's what they expect." "And yours will be true," Sarah said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And that's better." I wanted to believe her, but the ghost of Lucas's accusation from plebe year, the suggestion that my success was somehow unearned, that I had a hidden advantage, still lingered. It had become a quiet soundtrack to every achievement. Winning this felt like the only way to finally silence it, not just for him, but for myself. The following afternoon, our company wardroom was thick with a different kind of tension. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air above the polished tables. A group of us were gathered for a review session, our Forrestal draft spread out before us. Professor Chen had agreed to an informal discussion, and his presence was a calm, steadying force. He moved between clusters of midshipmen, offering a quiet comment here, a probing question there. Lucas held court at the head of one table, surrounded by his usual cohort. His delivery was polished, confident, citing doctrinal manuals and historical precedents with an ease that spoke of his upbringing. I listened from my spot, contributing only when directly asked, my own ideas feeling raw and unrefined next to his seamless oration. "The flaw in your argument, Valdez," Lucas said, not looking at me but addressing the table at large, "is that it leans too heavily on subjective interpretation. Personal letters are interesting for a biography, but for a strategic analysis, we need concrete data, the unassailable logic of outcomes." Professor Chen, who had been listening nearby, interjected softly. "But Lucas, can we ever truly understand the outcome without understanding the man who made the decision? Command is not a mathematical formula. It is a human art, fraught with doubt. Isabella's approach has merit." Lucas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The public correction, gentle as it was a rare occurrence. A few glances flickered in my direction. The air in the room shifted. "With all due respect, Professor," Lucas said, his voice gaining an edge, "some of us have to rely solely on the published texts. We don't all have the benefit of dedicated mentorship to guide us through the archival weeds." The wardroom went quiet. The hum of the ventilation system suddenly seemed loud. He had done it again, but this time it wasn't a muttered insinuation in a hallway. It was a public challenge, deliberate and sharp. My face grew warm. Sarah, sitting beside me, stiffened. Professor Chen's expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "The archives are open to every midshipman, Mr. Mitchell. The only prerequisite is initiative." But Lucas wasn't looking at Professor Chen anymore. He was looking directly at me, his gaze cool and challenging. The pressure that had been building for 2.5 years, the condescension, the whispered doubts, coalesced into a hot, sharp point in my chest. "Is that what it is? Initiative?" Lucas's voice was loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Or is it something else? You show up here, a certain story from a certain background, and suddenly you're not just competing, you're leading. For some people, that's a very compelling narrative for the Academy to promote. It looks good. It checks a box." The silence was absolute. He had finally said the quiet part out loud. He wasn't just accusing me of having help. He was accusing me of being a token, of my success being a political convenience rather than an earned achievement. The anger that rose in me wasn't the hot, flashy kind I'd felt as a plebe. It was colder, deeper, a solid thing. I felt the eyes of everyone in the wardroom on me. My classmates, Professor Chen, and I realized with a jolt Commander Reed, who had just entered the room and stood frozen by the door, her face an unreadable mask of discipline. Sarah started to speak, her voice a low growl. "Mitchell, you arrogant." I placed a hand on her arm, stopping her. The gesture was calm, but inside everything was focused, crystalline. This was it. The moment I could either let his poison sink in or stand up in a way that couldn't be ignored. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of my family's name, Valdez, a name that had never asked for anything, only worked. I thought of my father's hands, rough from a lifetime of labor, and the quiet pride in his eyes when I left for the academy. This wasn't just about me anymore. I stood up. The movement was smooth, deliberate. My voice, when it came out, was quieter than I expected, but it carried in the dead silence. "You're right, Lucas," I said, and the use of his first name made him blink. "My background is different from yours. I didn't grow up with portraits of admirals on the wall. I grew up with a father who worked 2 shifts so his children could have a chance at one. The only legacy I have is the belief that hard work is its own reward." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of my peers. You talk about boxes to be checked. The only box I've been focused on is the one that says Excel. I've spent every weekend for the past 3 years in this library or on the training grounds while others were enjoying their liberty. I've read every text, yes, but I've also read the letters, the diaries, the after-action reports that nobody else bothers with because they're not in the approved syllabus. That's not mentorship, Lucas. That's called doing the work. I took a step toward him. The anger was still there, but it was channeled now, a precise tool. You see my success as a threat to your tradition, but maybe the tradition that needs examining isn't the one of bloodline, but the one of entitlement. The belief that this uniform is an inheritance rather than something earned with sweat and grit. Admiral Forrestal himself came from humble beginnings. He understood the weight of command because he understood the value of the lives he was responsible for, lives that came from every background, from every story, just like this room. I finally stopped, standing directly before him. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heart beating. So if my story is compelling, it's not because it checks a box. It's because it's true, and I've earned every single word of it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth in the words did all the work. Lucas stared at me, his face pale, his arrogant facade completely shattered. He had no rebuttal. There was none to give. The silence stretched, broken only by the crisp sound of Commander Reed's heels on the linoleum as she walked toward the center of the room. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice like chilled steel, "my office, now." He stood, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, and followed her out without a word. The door clicked shut behind them, and the wardroom erupted into a low buzz of conversation, all of it directed at me. There were looks of shock, of respect, of newfound wariness. Sarah grabbed my hand under the table, squeezing it tightly. Professor Chen offered me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was over, and everything had changed. Winning the Forrestal Essay Award a week later felt almost like an afterthought. The ceremony in the Great Hall was all pomp and tradition, the bright lights and the weight of the medal around my neck. I gave a short, rehearsed speech, my voice steady. I saw Professor Chen in the audience, his pride evident. Sarah was beaming, looking like she might burst. But my eyes kept drifting to the back of the hall, where Lucas Mitchell stood alone, his uniform perfect, his face a carefully controlled blank. He was defeated, truly and thoroughly. There was no satisfaction in seeing it, just a strange, hollow feeling. The confrontation had been necessary, but it had cost us both something. After the ceremony, Commander Reed summoned me to her office. The room was spare and efficient, much like the woman herself. A single photograph of a ship cutting through a gray sea sat on her desk. "At ease, Midshipman Valdez," she said as I stood rigidly before her. She gestured to a chair. "Sit." I did, my back straight, the Forrestal medal heavy on my chest. "What happened in the wardroom was unacceptable," she began, her hands folded on the desk. "Midshipman Mitchell has been formally reprimanded for conduct unbecoming. It will be noted in his permanent record." I nodded, unsure of what to say. But that is not why I called you here, she continued, her gaze direct and assessing. I called you here to tell you that your response was exemplary. You defended your honor without losing your bearing. You articulated a principle that this institution claims to hold dear, but sometimes forgets in practice. Merit. She leaned forward slightly. I have watched you, Valdez, for 3 years. I see the hours you keep. I see the intensity of your effort. Do not for 1 second believe that your presence here is about anything other than that effort. You have earned your place. Never let anyone, regardless of their name or their rank, make you doubt that again. Is that clear? Yes, ma'am, I said, my throat tight with an emotion I couldn't name. Good, dismissed. I walked out of her office, the sounds of the academy echoing around me, the distant shouts of a drill, the tramp of feet on granite. The validation was overwhelming, a wave that threatened to buckle my knees. I had found my voice, and in doing so, I had solidified my place. But as I walked back to my room, the image of Lucas, isolated and humbled at the back of the hall, stayed with me. The victory was complete, but the air still tasted of ashes. The path ahead was clearer than ever, but it also felt lonelier. I had proven my point, but the cost of the battle was a landscape forever altered. The sun hadn't yet crested the horizon over the Severn River, but Bancroft Hall was already a hive of controlled chaos. For 4 years, this sprawling dormitory had been my home, my prison, and my proving ground. Today, it would become a memory. The air smelled of floor wax, fresh linen, and the faint, metallic scent of nerves. I stood before the full-length mirror in my room, my fingers tracing the gold braid on the sleeve of my dress whites. The uniform was heavier than it had been on plebe summer, weighted down with 4 years of lessons learned, failures endured, and quiet victories won. Sarah burst into the room, her own uniform impeccable, her face a radiant mixture of excitement and sentimental tears. Issa Valdez, brigade commander, I still can't say it without getting chills. She came up behind me, her reflection grinning next to my more solemn one. Look at you. I met her eyes in the glass. The girl staring back was both familiar and a stranger. The determined set of the jaw was the same, the dark, observant eyes that had always taken in more than they gave away. But the uncertainty that had haunted them during plebe year, the constant need to prove I belonged, had been replaced by a quiet steadiness. The lines of the uniform no longer seemed to wear me, I wore them. I keep thinking I'll wake up, I admitted, my voice softer than I intended. Well, don't, Sarah said, giving my shoulders a firm squeeze. You earned this. Every late night in the library, every time you shut down one of Mitchell's smug comments with a better answer in class, every damn push-up. This is yours. Her loyalty was a constant, a warm, unshakable force that had anchored me through countless storms. A knock at the doorframe made us both turn. Commander Reed stood there, her posture ramrod straight, her expression as inscrutable as ever. But there was a faint softening around her eyes that I'd only seen on rare occasions. Midshipman Valdez, a moment, she said, her voice crisp. Sarah gave me a knowing look and slipped out, patting Commander Reed's arm affectionately as she passed. I'll see you on the parade ground, ma'am. Once we were alone, Commander Reed stepped fully into the room. Her gaze swept over me, from the perfectly aligned cover on my head to the polished toes of my shoes. It was the same assessing look she'd given me during my first awkward plebe inspection, but the outcome was decidedly different. You have navigated a difficult path, Valdez, she began, her hands clasped behind her back. This institution is built on tradition, and traditions are often guarded by those who benefit from them most. You have challenged those assumptions not with loud words, but with silent, relentless excellence. That is a far more powerful argument. I swallowed, my throat tight. Thank you, Commander. I had good guidance. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. You had the necessary raw material. My job was merely to ensure it was not prematurely polished into something less interesting. She paused, and her gaze intensified. The brigade commander does not lead because she is the most popular or the most connected. She leads because she is the most capable. Remember that today. The eyes of the entire brigade, the superintendent, your families, they will all be on you. Your composure will set the tone. Your confidence will be their confidence. I understand, ma'am. I know you do. She gave a single, sharp nod. That is why you are standing here. Carry on, midshipman. She turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Her words settled over me, not as a burden but as a final, crucial piece of armor. She had always been strict, but her justice had been absolute. She had never once treated me as anything less than a future officer, even when others, like Lucas Mitchell, had made it their mission to do so. The memory of the announcement yesterday in the superintendent's office flashed in my mind. The 5 of us who were finalists for the top positions stood at attention, the portraits of past admirals seeming to stare down at us. Lucas was to my right, his posture perfect, his face a mask of arrogant certainty. He had been the presumptive favorite since day one, the Mitchell legacy a seemingly unstoppable force. When the superintendent had cleared his throat and said, "The position of brigade commander for the graduating class will be held by Midshipman Isabella Valdez," the world had seemed to stop. I'd heard the sharp, almost imperceptible intake of breath from Lucas. I'd kept my eyes fixed on a point on the wall ahead, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was only when we were dismissed and I was walking out, my hand on the doorknob, that I dared a glance back. Lucas was still standing there, staring out the window, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. It wasn't the anger I expected, but something closer to defeat. It was the first crack in the granite facade I'd witnessed in 4 years. Now, standing on the edge of the parade field, the reality of it was almost overwhelming. The bleachers were packed with families. I scanned the crowd until I found them. My mother, her face streaked with happy tears, my father holding her hand, his chest puffed out with a pride I could feel from 100 yards away. They had mortgaged their quiet life in San Antonio to give me this chance, and the sight of them was a potent reminder of why every moment of struggle had been worth it. The command was given, and the brigade of midshipmen began to march. My voice, calling the orders, sounded strangely calm and authoritative to my own ears. The synchronized crunch of 1,000 heels on the turf was a thunderous rhythm that vibrated up through my bones. I led the formation, my every movement a performance of precision, my mind a whirlwind of sensory details. The crisp white of the ranks behind me, the brilliant blue of the sky, the distant sound of the Naval Academy Band playing Anchors Aweigh. For 4 years, I had been a part of this machine, a single cog trying to mesh perfectly. Today, I was the one setting the pace. As we marched, my life here unspooled in my mind like a film. The terrified plebe stumbling through knowledge tests, clutching Admiral Forrestal's letters like a lifeline. The exhausting grind of navigation drills until the charts made sense. The fierce, whispered debates with Sarah late into the night about ethics and leadership. The quiet, affirming nods from Professor Chen after class when I'd offered an unconventional interpretation of a historical battle. And always, the constant, grating presence of Lucas Mitchell, his dismissive comments a whetstone on which I had sharpened my resolve. He had been my antagonist, but in a strange way, he had also been a catalyst. His unwavering belief in the old ways had forced me to define and defend the new ones I represented. The ceremony was a blur of speeches and tradition. When my name was called to receive my diploma and commission, the applause was a roaring wave that seemed to lift me to the stage. I shook the superintendent's hand, accepted the leather tube containing my commission as an ensign in the United States Navy, and saluted. The gesture, once so awkward and practiced, was now as natural as breathing. As I turned to face the crowd, my eyes swept over my fellow graduates. I saw Sarah beaming, her applause the most enthusiastic of all. I saw Professor Chen, sitting with the faculty, offering a slow, deliberate nod of profound respect. And I saw Lucas. He was clapping, his face unreadable. There was no scowl, no mockery, just a quiet, thoughtful expression. The formalities ended. Hats flew into the air in a traditional white cloud of celebration. The rigid formation dissolved into a chaotic, joyful scrum of hugs, handshakes, and photographs. I was swallowed by my classmates, their congratulations genuine and warm. For a long while, I was passed from one embrace to another, the daughter of a mechanic from Texas, now an officer and a leader. I finally extricated myself, needing a moment of quiet. I walked toward the sea-wall, the leather tube containing my commission held tightly in my hand. The Annapolis harbor was busy, gray warships cutting through the water, their presence a tangible promise of the future that started now. I heard a hesitant step behind me. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. Some rivalries create a frequency you learn to sense. Valdez. I turned, Lucas Mitchell stood a few feet away, his cover tucked under his arm. The arrogant tilt of his chin was gone. He looked tired and earnest. "Mitchell," I replied, my tone neutral. He gestured vaguely toward the ceremony behind us. "That was impressive. You led well today." "Thank you." An awkward silence stretched between us, filled with the cries of gulls and the distant hum of the city. He scuffed the toe of his highly polished shoe against the pavement. "Look, I know I haven't made things easy for you. These past 4 years." He finally met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw no hostility in his blue eyes, only a stark and uncomfortable honesty. I was wrong. The simplicity of the admission hung in the air. It was more powerful than any argument he'd ever made. "About what specifically?" I asked, not to antagonize him, but because I needed to hear it. I needed to know what this moment meant. He let out a short, humorless breath. "About everything. About what makes an officer, about tradition, about you." He looked out at the water, gathering his thoughts. "I thought it was about bloodlines, about a name. That if you didn't have that history, that ingrained sense of entitlement, I suppose you couldn't possibly understand the weight of command. I thought my birthright was a head start you could never overcome." He turned back to me, his expression grim. "But you didn't try to overcome it, you just worked. You studied Forrestal's fears when I was just memorizing his victories. You saw the fleet not as an inheritance, but as a responsibility to be earned. I was competing for a title. You were preparing to lead sailors." He paused, and his voice dropped. "My father pulled some strings to get me an interview with the selection board for the subs. I got the assignment I wanted. But when the chairman mentioned your name, he said your essay on the psychological toll of command was the most insightful thing he'd read in a decade. He said it demonstrated a maturity I hadn't shown." So the Forrestal essay had been the final, definitive proof. The late nights in the library, the connection I'd felt with the long-dead admiral's private doubts, had resonated in a way I never could have imagined. "I owe you an apology, Isabella," he said, using my first name for the first time ever. The formality of Valdez had been a weapon in our rivalry. Its absence now was a surrender. "It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. You beat me fair and square. You're the better officer." The words I had craved for 4 years landed not with a sense of triumph, but with a surprising weight of shared experience. We had both been forged in the same crucible. His arrogance and my tenacity were just 2 different fuels burning in the same furnace. "I didn't do it to beat you, Lucas," I said quietly. "I did it for me, for my parents, for every kid from a neighborhood like mine who wonders if a place like this is for them." "I know that now," he said. "That's what makes it worse, and that's what makes you better." He hesitated, then extended his hand. "A fresh start, Ensign." I looked at his hand, then at his face. The ghost of the arrogant plebe was still there, but it was overshadowed by the humbled, and perhaps better, man he had become. The rivalry was over. We were colleagues now. I took his hand. His grip was firm. "A fresh start, Ensign Mitchell," I said. He nodded, a look of profound relief washing over his features. "Good luck out there, Valdez." "You too." He turned and walked away, blending into the crowd of celebrating graduates. The chapter was closed. Did the world just end? Sarah's voice came from beside me, her eyes wide as she watched Lucas disappear. Did Lucas Mitchell actually exhibit a fully formed human emotion? "I think he did," I said, a real smile finally breaking through my composed facade. "Well, miracles never cease." She looped her arm through mine. "Professor Chen is looking for you. He wants a picture, and your parents are about to burst with pride. Come on, Brigade Commander, your public awaits." We walked back toward the noise and the celebration. Professor Chen was waiting, his sharp eyes crinkling at the corners. "Isabella," he said warmly, "a journey worth taking, was it not?" "Every step, Professor, thank you, for everything." "The pleasure was mine. I have a feeling Admiral Forrestal would have appreciated your essay a great deal. You understood the man behind the legend." He patted my shoulder, a rare gesture of affection from him. "The fleet is getting a fine officer today." Later, after countless photos and tearful goodbyes with Sarah, who was headed to flight school in Pensacola, I found myself alone again. I sat on a bench overlooking the water, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I unrolled the heavy parchment of my commission. The formal script declared me an ensign in the United States Navy. My name: Isabella Valdez. I traced the letters with my finger. The ink wasn't just ink, it was every drop of sweat on the obstacle course, every moment of doubt conquered, every page of a book read by flashlight after taps. It was the sound of my mother's voice on the phone, telling me to be strong. It was the unwavering support of a friend like Sarah and the quiet guidance of mentors like Professor Chen and Commander Reed. It was even the relentless pressure from Lucas Mitchell, which had, in its own way, hardened my resolve into something unbreakable. I was no longer the scared girl from San Antonio, terrified of being found out. I was Issa Valdez. I was an officer. The journey had been long and the path had been steep, but as I looked out at the endless possibility of the sea, I felt a deep, solid peace. The salute wasn't just a gesture anymore. It was a promise I had made to myself, and today I had finally kept it. I was ready.